Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everybody, depending on where you are. My name's Kate Fleming, as Dario said, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon, as it is in Yorkshire time here in the UK, to talk to you a bit more about meta-ethnography. And just to say that I've got no actual potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. So hopefully a number of you have been with us throughout the series of these webinars that we started 6 months ago. Gosh, time flies, back in October. But it's just to remind you of kind of what's gone before around the introduction, the question formulation, the selecting of studies and assessing methodological limitations, a session specifically on framework synthesis and best fit framework synthesis, and also thematic synthesis that have gone before. So meta-ethnography is the next in the series and is one of the specific approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis, and is kind of the third of the three core approaches that the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods group kind of recommend as methods for synthesis. Is what we call one of our core approaches to synthesis. So that's where it fits with what's gone before. And after today, there's two more sessions currently scheduled. One on the 25th of April, looking at grade Cirqual, which is being led by Megan Wainwright. And then finally, on the 16th of May, integrating qualitative evidence synthesis with intervention effect findings with Angela Harden and James Thomas again. So that kind of completes the whole series, and we're looking at whether there may be additional ones as well. So just to run through the aims of the session today, the key aim is to kind of introduce you to meta-ethnography, if you haven't come across it before, and some of its historical development. We wanted to also look at the processes associated with meta-ethnography, look at whether they're similar to the other approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis and where they differ. Look at some of the questions that a meta-ethnography can answer. And finally, to introduce reporting guideline Emerge, which is one that's been specifically developed for the reporting and meta-ethnographies. And I want to give huge thanks at this point to my fellow co-conveners and Emma France, to Ruth Garside and Jane Noyes, who are co-conveners, and Emma France, who works closely with our group, because they've very recently written the draft of the chapter on meta-ethnography for our upcoming handbook on qualitative evidence synthesis that we're producing. And I've drawn a lot on their writing for this presentation. And Ruth particularly was sorry that she couldn't be with us today. So where did it all begin? An actual book called Meta-ethnography. So the other approaches that you've seen over the course of the series haven't had an actual book. So I even thought I'll pick it up and bring it with me today. So it's quite a thin little book there, but actually it was written by George Noblet and Dwight Hare back in 1988. So that's where it all began. It's the kind of oldest known approach to qualitative evidence synthesis, certainly since in this modern era in which we're doing it. So it's the one kind of with the longest established roots, and probably the one with the most methodological work been done around it. So what's it all about? So I thought it's helpful to kind of refer back to this original text of meta-ethnography written by Noblet and Hare, because actually what they originally said about it still really applies. It's undergone different uses. It started in education and it's moved into healthcare by the fact it was picked up by evidence synthesis people in the UK. But actually this original meaning that they talk about here, the meaning of meta-ethnography for us, is a form of synthesis for ethnographic and other interpretive studies. So that may answer one of your first questions if you're not that familiar with meta-ethnography. Is it only for synthesizing ethnographies? The answer is no. Right from the beginning when they established it, it was a synthesis for ethnographic or other interpretive studies, other interpretive qualitative studies. And interestingly, it's quite fascinating to think why it's called meta-ethnography. And they say in part because of the analogy to meta-analysis. So the time they were writing this, and if we look back at the history of evidence synthesis and systematic reviews and the role of meta-analysis, this, the late 80s is about the time when meta-analysis was starting to really take off as a statistical method and to prove its worth. And so when Noblet and Hare wrote their book on meta-ethnography, they kind of wanted it to be seen along similar lines, but around ethnographic and interpretive studies, and thought, well, if we call it meta-ethnography, people will see that it's analogous to meta-analysis. And because they shared the goal, as they say here, of those proposing meta-analytic and integrative research reviews of putting together all the research available to us. But I quite like that analogy that they had back in the 1980s about it. So just to give me a sense, and Jane as well, who's obviously very kindly agreed to come along and support your questions in the chat box, just want to do a quick poll here. And if you answer which one of these most applies to you, because you could actually have all three, but which one most applies to you? And that's, have you done a meta-ethnography? Have you read a meta-ethnography? Or have you heard about it and want to know more? And I guess if you've never heard of it, we didn't give you that option. You had done by the fact that you signed up for this webinar today. You're all very welcome. Okay, nice to see these coming in. So it seems like most of people on the whole have heard of it and want to know more, which is fantastic. And I'm glad you're here today, and hopefully you will learn more about it today as well. That some of you have read a meta-ethnography, and a small number of you have actually done a meta-ethnography. And that's probably what I would have expected when I set up the poll, but it's always good to know, because actually if you all said you'd done a meta-ethnography, I might quite suddenly change tack as to what I was going to say to you. So thanks very much for filling that in. Thank you. So it is a really widely used method of qualitative evidence synthesis. And what it really does, it enables a very systematic and a very detailed understanding of how studies are related. And how it does that is similar to kind of what you've heard about before if you've been in the other sessions, and particularly around thematic synthesis, through the comparison of findings both within a study and then across the studies. And as Noblet and Hare put it here, these are coded and condensed into themes, which ultimately provide an interpretation of the whole body of research. So that if you were with us for the last session in February, when Angela Harden James Thomas talked about thematic synthesis, that does sound really quite similar. And there certainly are some similarities between the two approaches. So we've got coded and condensed findings ultimately into themes, which provide an interpretation of the whole body of research. Actually, how this is done from the interpretive perspective really depends on what's in each of those individual studies and then how they relate to each other. And we'll come on to that later on in this presentation, because there are different ways of doing it within the kind of umbrella of meta-ethnography. That depends on what's in the individual papers that you find. Okay. So just a little bit of background. So I've given you some of the history already, that it was actually developed to synthesize ethnographies of education studies. And it's the approach that Noblet and Hare developed for that. And in its original form, the book here only described the methods for synthesis, as in how do you put your group of studies together? How do you synthesize them together? And not the other steps in a systematic review. And so, through this series, we've talked about searching for papers, doing methodological appraisal and all those other, and formulating questions. So all those other steps in a systematic review weren't actually covered in the original text. It was literally about how you synthesize studies together. There's some fantastic work done about 20 years ago, and this is where, kind of, as I said earlier on, it's the one that's probably had most methodological work undertaken on it, by Nikki Britton and various colleagues who actually got research funding to undertake this work, which has kind of got the original traction around qualitative evidence synthesis as well. And that was about they did some work looking at the ways patients take medicines that are prescribed to them and use meta-ethnography around that. So the original synthesis component of the meta-ethnography is now usually used as part of a complete quest approach. So they start by the question formulation and the focus of the review and moving on from there. So it isn't generally used just on its own as a synthesis approach, but actually as part of a qualitative evidence synthesis, which then becomes called a meta-ethnography. Just when they wrote it, those other components for qualitative evidence synthesis, such around question formulation and searching, weren't established at all. And as I said right at the beginning, it is one of the core quest methods for Cochrane. So when might a meta-ethnography be useful? So its aims are to produce this kind of much more theoretical approach or theoretical outcome than we've talked about through the previous approaches. And they talk about producing new configurations or interpretations from the included qualitative studies. And what's really key, I think, to meta-ethnography and probably sets it apart from other approaches is this idea of preserving what they call meaning in context. So actually very much about the context in which the studies were undertaken, and when you group them together, excuse me, when you group them together, actually preserving the context and the meaning in which that context, the meaning in which the context was derived in those studies. And that essentially is talking very much more about the kind of the really perceptions and experiences and behaviours that I talk about later in the slide here of individuals, about the meaning in the context in which those perceptions, experiences and behaviours are lived or perceived or occur. And very much it's about the supporting the development, either development of new theory or extension of theory. So it's this kind of much higher level output from a meta-ethnography, ideally. And it's very suitable for kind of emergent review questions and about this seeking to understand perceptions, experience and behaviours, and then producing new theory. So therefore, it's kind of really important to note that it's very much an interpretive method of synthesis and not a more aggregative one where you're just kind of putting findings together and potentially even kind of just grouping them and counting them. Okay, so in relation to meta-ethnography, there's 7 steps, and you see the first one is innovatively called Getting Started. We did meet George Noblet during the development of the reporting guidelines that I'll talk about later, and I did say to him that I thought it was a really great kind of first point. There's not many, normally they're more innovatively titled than Getting Started. Then there's deciding what's relevant, then there's reading the studies, determining how they're related, translating them into one another, and that's where the real kind of meta-ethnography bit comes in, synthesizing them and then expressing the synthesis. So I'll go through each one of those in turn. So the getting started component, that's very much about, they call, is finding something that's worthy of a synthesis effort. And so within that, we've talked about focusing the review before, and actually within that you need to consider about, is a meta-ethnography appropriate for the question that you're asking? Is a synthesis on this topic needed? And what experience does the team need? And when I was going through this, I thought actually what we need to highlight here is actually about thinking about the retreat criteria that we've talked about already. And for those of you who haven't been on previous webinars, just to quickly run through that, in relation to what kind of qualitative evidence synthesis you're going to do, you need to think about the review question, the epistemology, what type of knowledge is the review trying to address, how long has the team got the time, the resources, how much money, how many people have you got available, the expertise. And certainly with meta-ethnography, we do always recommend that you've got somebody with experience of undertaking meta-ethnography or really good knowledge of it to have on the team, because it has this kind of quite different approach. The audience and the purpose, so who's it for and how will they use it? And then finally, what kind of data will be included? And certainly for meta-ethnography, it's very interpretive, qualitative study. So it's just a kind of a revisit of the retreat criteria for you. So looking at a couple of meta-ethnographies that have been published and just trying to look at the aim of those in relation to kind of the getting started, finding something worthy of a synthesis effort that we talked about. So this first one in the International Journal of Drug Policy, interplay between substance use and intimate partner violence perpetration and meta-ethnography. And the aim here was to explore how substance use features in survivors and perpetrators' accounts of intimate partner violence perpetration. And the second one here, published in Pain Medicine, A Healing Journey with Chronic Pain, about actually how do you heal from chronic pain. And the aim of that meta-ethnography was to identify qualitative research that explored the experience of living with chronic pain and to understand the process of recovery. So again, both of those very different topics for meta-ethnography, but actually very much about that individual perception and that perception from within somebody's context, so living with intimate partner violence or living with chronic pain and the experience of that and the experience of healing from that. So again, that very rich contextual experience there. So the second bit is deciding what's relevant, and this kind of refers back to the scope of searching, and I refer you back also to Andrew Booth's session on question formulation and searching for evidence, which is on the pre-records on the Learning Live webinar website. So the scope of searching in a meta-ethnography, it can be comprehensive, or it could be more targeted and purposive in approach. As in, you might try and find everything on the topic, or you might have a very specific approach that's quite purposive. So similar to purposive sampling in primary qualitative research. And that depends a little bit on the topic and the context of the review, which I'll come on to a bit more. So within that, it's worth thinking about actually, within a meta-ethnography, you can only really incorporate qualitative studies whose findings are conceptually rich or contain a really good thick description, because it requires a level of interpretation that requires those data to be in the primary studies. And going back to that example I gave right at the beginning, around those 3 reviews that we did, one of the reasons we struggled with the healthcare professionals review is that actually the individual papers had quite descriptive findings that were quite thin and were very different to the very rich descriptions we got in the women's and the partners review. So they really weren't suited to a meta-ethnographic approach. And in hindsight, we shouldn't have done a meta-ethnography, but you live and learn. Also, you want, this descriptive studies which lack conceptual contextual detail aren't well suited to synthesis using meta-ethnography. And so this is to flag up here that it can be very difficult to say that you are definitely going to do a meta-ethnography a priori until you know the kind of qualitative papers you've got and the data that are within them. So what you can do if you're writing a proposal or a protocol is say that you aim to use an interpretive approach, such as thematic synthesis or meta-ethnography, but won't decide on the approach that you will use definitively until you've identified what the data within the qualitative paper and the richness of those has been assessed. So that's kind of a bit of a flag for you there, that it's very hard to say up front, I've done it and I've made that mistake. And actually that you need to be more cautious in saying what you're going to do ahead of time. So back to the idea of sampling, just to give you an example here. So the review here by Strick and others, the meta-ethnography for purpose of meaningful occupation for people living with dementia. So in this particular review, they included only conceptually rich studies first. So those papers that they identified that really kind of address the question in a rich and thick way in those primary studies. And then looked at the remainder of the articles that they could have included and sought to base and sample based on their ability to either refute or advance the emerging concepts, so either that they disagreed with or that they further enhanced the emerging conceptual framework that they got from the conceptually rich studies. Okay. So reading the studies is stage 3. And what Noblet and Hare call repeated rereading of the accounts. And again, this is something that you would naturally do in any qualitative evidence synthesis, and I would say in any evidence synthesis really. But actually, it's about familiarising yourself with the findings of the studies, with the studies themselves, who was included in the studies, the context in which the studies occurred, and their findings. And that's very similar to being immersed in data during primary qualitative research. It can potentially identify additional areas of inquiry, either to the topic base or the theory base, and from that you may want to go and do some additional targeted searching, and also it can allow the identification of an index paper. And what we mean by an index paper is kind of what you tend in most reviews to get 1 or 2 papers that really kind of, I think, address the nub of the question, that really focus solely on the topic or the focus of your review. And the other papers that I find tend to in part deal with it, I would say. And if you're lucky, you've got a number of index papers, but you may only have 1. You may have that index paper kind of identified before you go into a review, and you may want to look at your searches to check that it comes up. But equally, it may only emerge when you start to do this repeated rereading of the accounts. So then the next stage is determining how the studies are related. So this is where we start to get into more of the process of the synthesis, and it refers to how you put the studies together. And this is where it starts to differ a little bit. Excuse me, I'm struggling a little bit with the cold today. So what Nobbert and Hare talked about in relation to this was that actually we think it makes sense to create a list of the key metaphors, phrases, ideas and or concepts in each account. So in each of the individual studies, they talk about making a list of the key metaphors or the phrases or ideas. And they talk earlier in the book about actually what they mean by the key metaphors of a study, because a lot of what comes up in meta-ethnography is a real kind of use of language. And actually what they mean by something, they then do tend to go and define for you, because otherwise there is definitely some degree of misinterpretation around meta-ethnography. So they say, again, referring back to the original text, what they mean by this is they're referring what others may call themes. So we often see themes emerging in primary qualitative studies, the perspective, organisers, and all the concepts revealed by the qualitative studies. So all of these different things, and they will be reported in different ways in the individual primary studies as well. And then they talk about looking at the relationship between them. So I think there's something about first and second order information just popped up in the question. So this hopefully will address some of that, but we can also come back to it at the end because we'll have more time. So looking at actually the data in the primary qualitative studies that a meta-ethnography focuses on, and actually we're talking about the author's interpretations in included papers, and these are sometimes called second order constructs. So just very briefly to go through what we mean by a second order construct compared to a first or a third order. So first order constructs are those things that what we call everyday ways of making sense of our world. And in a qualitative study, in a primary qualitative study, we'll see these as the participants' quotes. The second order constructs we've put here social science, but researchers' interpretations of what we call this common sense world. So our interpretations as researchers of what people have said about their world, and they get sort of interpreted into academic concepts, excuse me, and theories. And then the third order constructs are what we do as a reviewer if we go to higher level interpretation of the researcher's interpretation. So it's moving away from the kind of the primary participant quotes right through up to the level of interpretation. And what you tend to see in well-reported meta-ethnographies is that we have participant quotes used that support concepts or second order constructs as in addition to the concepts. And that's really quite important and one of the unique features of meta-ethnography. And I'll come on to that, why that is very shortly. So there's three different ways of translating the studies into one another. And this is where the language of meta-ethnography can get a little bit tricky. So what do we mean by translating the studies into one another, and how does that differ from a thematic synthesis? So in a way, in the box at the top there, you can see the approach to synthesis depends on how the studies are related and uses constant comparison to develop an understanding of the phenomenon of interest. So in a way, they can be related to each other in 3 ways and not be related at all, which is the 4th way. So if they're about really different things, then there isn't any point in synthesizing them because it's just all too different. So then Noblet and Hare talk about reciprocal translation, which is this where studies are about roughly similar things. So all the concepts reported in those studies are roughly similar. And this is where you can undertake a reciprocal translation. So actually, how are the findings in this particular study similar to the findings in the next study? Equally, though, they may be studies that refute each other, and in which case you can undertake a refutational synthesis. Mostly what we see, it has to be said, are reciprocal translation or reciprocal translation analysis, shortened to an RTA. But because of the nature of the focus of the study and the way that searches are conducted, the papers tend to be included that are about roughly similar things. So what you tend to see in a meta-ethnography is this first level of translation, which is reciprocal translation. How are the studies similar to each other? Sometimes you do see a refutational synthesis that brings in elements of studies that actually start to refute each other, that might bring a contrasting view in. And then this very final stage is where we begin to get this higher level interpretation through what we call a line of argument synthesis. So what's a line of argument that runs through the studies and that it particularly comes through the reciprocal translations or the stage of translation? And this is kind of progressively built up through the process of comparing and contrasting the studies. Okay. So this pretty much just sums up what I've just said, but actually what the goal is of translation. So the ultimate goal of translation is to develop concepts and metaphors which embody more than one study. So actually producing a whole that is greater than the individual papers. But coming back to that point that I talked about earlier on about the individual participants' quotes needing to that can be used to illustrate the concepts. What Noblet and Hare originally talked about was translation. So this first level of synthesis talks about the need to protect the particular, respect the holism, and enable comparison. And I really like this quote. And for me, this is kind of the nuts and bolts of meta-ethnography, because actually in pulling and synthesizing all these studies together, what we need to do is to protect the particular, those individuals who said particular things in those individual studies that then can get represented within a meta-ethnography. But the translations respect the whole of the body of the papers, but within that enable comparison. And this is where I think a meta-ethnography is the most complex of the qualitative evidence synthesis approaches, and actually is where it takes it aside from thematic synthesis, which you can say is like, well, we're comparing the themes across the papers and this is how they come together. It's actually this much more kind of multifaceted approach that you get within a meta-ethnography. Okay. So stage 6 is about synthesizing the translation, and this is kind of, we've talked already, I've covered a lot of this. The translations as a set of one level of meta-ethnography, but they themselves can then be compared with one another and to see whether there are some that encompass others. And this is where you get the second level of synthesis and the line of argument that can emerge. Sorry. And to give you an example of this, to go back to the smoking pregnancy examples that I gave, this is the line at the top there. Context constrains positive behaviour change. It was kind of the overarching line of argument that emerged through the 4 translations that we got and that came through the meta-ethnography. And those translations were quite simply phrased. And were mapped onto, you can see somebody being, before they were pregnant and being a smoker, and then the dark blue box of being a pregnant smoker and the identity of that individual changing. They were kind of a smoker and taken for granted assumption that wasn't a problem, then became pregnant. And actually that then meant that they were a pregnant smoker. So they were undertaking a health behaviour in the context of being pregnant, which then had all sorts of social and moral implications for them. And actually, what happened through quitting smoking or trying to quit, and some of that was quite cyclical, or trying to undertake that behaviour, and then also continuing to smoke, which was not a comfortable position for many women, right through up until the point of delivery, and that is the smoking status there is where it's measured. The smoking prevalence in pregnancies in the UK is measured at the point of delivery, so that's why that's there. But actually, what you've got there is the illustrations of the translations, and then those being brought together in a line of argument, which is about actually throughout all of this, it was somebody's individual context that constrained their positive behaviour change, multifaceted as that was. Okay. So then finally, the final stage is about expressing the synthesis, and this involves what they call determining the meanings of the meta-ethnography for the intended audience. And it can be expressed as a new theory or a new model or conceptual framework. And a couple of examples here. Atkins and others in 2008 produced a hypothesis and a model of adherence to tuberculosis treatment from their meta-ethnography. And another example, I think it's 2018, not 2008 again, but I'll need to check. Their meta-ethnography of patients with colorectal cancer led to a new model showing the iterative process of achieving mastery over cancer. So different approaches as to how the findings of the meta-ethnography or the ultimate expression of the synthesis can occur. So it's very much about not only how you tell people what you've done, but actually what the end product is. And generally, though, we do write for academic audiences. Noblet and Hare expressed kind of all sorts of art and photography and all sorts of different ways of expressing a meta-ethnography. Generally, what we see is what's written in academic journals, it has to be said. So just to kind of sum up, it's a really useful method of qualitative evidence synthesis. It aims to provide an interpretation that's greater than the sum of the parts of the individual study. So we're looking at this whole. And I think it's personally particularly useful in examining issues that are related to people who may be vulnerable, may be marginalized, who experience, for whatever reason, inequality or inequity in life. And that comes back to the idea of protecting the particular, looking at the whole, but enabling comparison as well. It is very time consuming. Most syntheses are, though, so I don't think there's any one that's particularly quick. So it's worth mentioning, but it comes also down to that level of experience that you may need in your synthesis team. Okay. So that's about that. And about the process of meta-ethnography in a very small nutshell. It's quite a complex method, but hopefully I can see there's lots of questions coming through, so we've got lots of time for those. But I just wanted to spend this last slide looking at the reported guidance that we've got for meta-ethnography. And this is something called Emerge, and it was a project that Jane was part of and was led most ably by Dr. Emma France at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and they got funding to fully develop, through the appropriate methodology, a reporting guidance for meta-ethnography. And as I said, unfortunately Dwight Hare died a number of years ago, but George Noblet was hugely involved in the development of the reporting guidance for his own method, which is just lovely. It's really, really interesting listening to him talk about how they developed the method and why, and its popularity in the States compared to certainly its popularity in the UK, particularly now. So the reporting guidance for meta-ethnography is called Emerge. It was published in 2019, and to show its prominence and its importance, actually, it was published in multiple journals. On the page there, you can see what it looks like when it was published in Journal of Advanced Nursing. The guidance, basically, there's 3 complementary parts. There's a guidance table, and that's a summary of the 19 reporting criteria, which is basically very much organised by the phases of meta-ethnography, and also indicates where each criteria might be reported in a publication. So it very much supports you through reporting of your meta-ethnography. It asks authors to describe their processes and to justify the choices made. It's similar to other reporting quest guidance in a way, but also there's very different in the differences are seen in the very specifics around the analysis and the synthesis phases, because that's where meta-ethnography most differs. That, as I say, we've kind of borrowed the other phases and brought those into meta-ethnography around searching and developing the focus of your study, the focus of your review. But actually meta-ethnography itself is really very much written about that, only about that synthesis approach. There's also explanatory notes that expand on how and why each of the reporting criteria describe further reporting considerations. And then there's an extension section of that, which is about how to report components that won't apply to every meta-ethnography. So there's those three components to it. So I'd really recommend that you have a read of those reporting guidance, because also in reading meta-ethnography, it also helps you understand what should be there as well if you're quite new to this. So it can be quite a supportive tool as well when you're reading meta-ethnography. So okay, and final slide there is the references from the session today.